Hello and welcome to the ABQ Show. I'm Wally Drangmeister, and our guest today is Jason Espinoza. He's the State Director of the National Federation of Independent Business. Jason, great to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
All right, small business. That's important everywhere. It's important in New Mexico. Jason, tell me, what is National Federation of Independent Business and what do you do here in New Mexico?
Certainly. So the NFIB for more than 75 years has really been the advocate for small business here in New Mexico, across the 50 states, in our nation's capital. And one thing that's really interesting is we are the only business association that exclusively advocates for small business. Everyone else does big business and small business, but because we understand that small business is different than big business, we exclusively represent and advocate for small businesses, which are really the engine of our country's economy.
Well, you bring up a great point. Small businesses and big businesses do have differences. I've worked in a lot of industries, and it seems like, for just an example, if a regulation's coming, big business, because they are big, it is a cost to them. Sometimes a new regulation comes and they might have to have 2 or 3 people. Right. But if they're a 1,000-person organization, 2 or 3 people barely hits the bottom line and you don't notice it. If you have to hire a person or 2 for a small business for some big new regulation or a contract or equivalent, it can kill you.
No, you're exactly right, and I think you stole my talking points.
Oh, sorry.
Because one of the things when you really talk about the difference between big business and small business is that regulatory cost. So there's been numerous studies done, and when you look on a per employee basis, small businesses are just hit hard and have such a high per employee regulatory cost. We're looking at nationwide $2 trillion worth of regulatory costs. Yeah. And that's huge when you're looking at small businesses who are looking to expand, who want to increase compensation. That takes a huge hit. There's an avalanche of regulations that impact small business.
Yeah, well, as we look at this kind of issue, big versus small and regulation, there are a lot of things that sound good, particularly when it comes to employee benefits, when it comes to regulation. But if those things go to their illogical conclusion, there won't be small businesses anymore. There will just be big businesses that can handle that overhead. What are some of the ones that are particularly problematic? And then if you have some examples of things getting better and maybe things getting worse.
Certainly. Well, one of the interesting things is, do people's opinions match the policies that are being put forward? So when we look at favorability studies, 90% of people, when you're looking at the political parties, 90% of Democrats and 90% of Republicans love small businesses. And that rate is much smaller when you're talking about big business.
Yes.
But when you're talking about issues like minimum wage, about paid sick leave, any other regulation, that disproportionately impacts that small business. Yes. The bigger businesses, they can spread that cost. They have a bunch of lawyers on retainer who can deal with the employment and legal issues. Right. Small businesses, they don't typically have accountants. They don't typically have a team of lawyers. It's that family-owned business in many cases who have to try to navigate that new system. So it really does hurt them. So there's some examples there. One of the great things that I do want to talk about, though, is we're seeing some progress on the federal level. So back in 2017, where you had Congress and the president sign into law the tax package, which we saw a reduction, and a lot of the talk and conversation goes to the corporate income tax rates. Right. But one of the most important things that came out of that really was the small business deduction. And so this allows pass-through entities, because most small businesses are set up as pass-through entities.
And for those who don't know, those are things, S-corps, LLCs, and so it's like they don't pay tax. The owner or the owners pay the tax. It comes through that entity tax return onto our personal tax return.
You're exactly right. A personal income tax is what matters to small business owners. So you're looking at really 90% of those small businesses are pass-through entities. And what the federal tax cuts did was create a small business deduction. So on that pass-through, you can deduct 20% of your income based on that, which was huge. Yeah. Unfortunately, one of the things, and this goes to presence in our nation's capital, is the corporate income tax rates are permanent. Unfortunately, the small business deduction isn't permanent. That's set to expire in 2025.
Okay, so it's just a little over 5 years away. We'll have to deal with that again.
Right, and currently, an NFIB is a big champion up there supporting legislation. There's currently legislation in both chambers of Congress looking to enact these. But one of the things that's, you always hear from the general person in the public saying, well, good, they got a tax cut, but what did they do with that money?
Right.
And again, there's been studies, disproportionately small businesses, when they save that money, they reinvest it back in the business. We're seeing investment in record numbers for wages, additional employees, business expansion. So they're doing exactly what our economy needs with that deduction.
No, that's fabulous. Now, what are some areas that the trend is not looking too good? Let's start with Washington, from Washington coming on down, that really is impacting small businesses, not only in New Mexico, but across the country.
Well, it's interesting, on the federal level, there isn't too much that is bad. A lot of it is good news. When we see a lot of the federal agencies looking at ways to reduce regulations, since that federal tax bill was signed into law in 2017, we've actually seen record growth numbers in terms of small business jobs every month.
Yes.
We've seen a 45 record year high in terms of business expansion and new jobs.
Yes.
We're seeing great things on the federal level. Where we're seeing, and we can talk about later, is what is the impact of your local policies, whether it be city or your state, and what impact is that having on small business investment?
Well, yeah, you brought up an interesting point. Our country as a whole is doing well.
Right.
We'll talk about state and local. So as we look at the people that you represent in New Mexico, how does New Mexico's small businesses compare to those in maybe more populous states or states around us? Are they big differences, or are there a lot of the people you represent very similar from state to state to state?
They're very similar from state to state. One thing that I think the audience may want to know is how do we define a small business? Because that is all over the map.
Yes.
You look at the U.S. Small Business Administration defines small businesses as under 500 employees.
And in New Mexico, that's a big business.
that is a big employer. But when you look at it really, especially in NFIB and across the country, 62% of small businesses or of all employers are between 1 and 4 employees.
Yes.
Your next largest category at 17% is between 5 and 9 employees. And NFIB's membership really reflects that.
Yes.
We are a small business nation, or we're a small business state here in New Mexico, and I think even more so when you look at those numbers, they're higher percentages.
Yeah. Okay, so for people getting into business who are in business, what do you see some of the biggest compliance challenges be? I have my own idea, but I will not steal your thunder.
Well, I think one of the things really when we need to look at specifically New Mexico is the legal environment.
Okay.
Whether it's, dealing with wage issues, whether it's dealing with hiring, whether it's, anything, the legal environment in New Mexico is not a favorable one.
Right.
I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are too.
Well, it just seems like to me the businesses I work with, doing marketing, they're trying to grow. Their employee issues are always a challenge. Finding good and keeping good employees, and they work hard on that. But just the minutia of all of the rules that come from a federal and state and local level now with proposals is increasingly. It's just, it can be overwhelming.
No, you're certainly right. When you're looking at hiring employees, you're looking at doing the right forms, and are we filling out, are getting the employees to fill out the right forms? Are we doing the record keeping correct, related to paid leave or their unemployment insurance? And that goes again to the difference between big and small businesses.
Right.
Those bigger businesses, they have the administrative functions. That's built into their business where they can do that. At the small business level, that's the owner. That may be the employee, the 2 other employees that are helping do that. So again, they're spending a disproportionate amount of time and their money on dealing with those regulatory issues rather than serving their customers, creating a better product, looking to expand and create jobs in their community.
Yeah. So tell us about some of the things you do from an education point of view, working with small businesses in New Mexico, helping them become knowledgeable of issues and working with them on their behalf.
Well, one of the most important things about NFIB is that we're a completely member-driven organization. So when we take stands on policy issues, one of the unique things about us is we actually ballot our members. So we send a ballot survey to our membership and say, what do you think about this issue? How do you care about it? And that's important to us because it shouldn't be the NFIB staff deciding those issues, but the small businesses across the country and then here in the state on New Mexico issues. Another thing that we really do try to do is work with our members and create avenues of contact and relationship with policymakers. So one of the things that we're actually working on this summer is create roundtables for small businesses to meet with their local legislators. A lot of the times, because business owners are busy, they're running their business day to day, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of time. So what we're going to be doing is looking around the state, looking at different communities from Los Lunas and Valencia County down to Silver City and Grant County, and bringing together small business owners to really talk with legislators about their issues. And I think that's a unique difference too. A lot of times, groups invite legislators, and the legislators talk to the small business people.
Right.
But this is an avenue we're bringing those legislators in for a roundtable. We want our business members, our small business owners, to tell them what issues are affecting them.
All right, very good. We're talking with Jason Espinoza, State Director of the National Federation of Independent Businesses. Jason, when we come back from the break, we will talk about some specifics here in New Mexico. We had a legislative session that just happened, and there was probably some good and bad and ugly, and that get your perspective. But as we go, we have a short video we'd love you to watch about the mission of NFIB. You're watching the ABQ Show here on ProView Networks.
Take a look around. You won't have to look far to see our impact on the world. We're builders, we're makers, inventors and designers, retailers and suppliers. We grow food, we serve food. We fix your car and your latest office technology. We work in health and we deal in hospitality. We invest. Sometimes we're family. Sometimes our work just makes us feel like family. We work with our hands and we work with our minds. We are small business, and we fuel the engine that drives this great nation's economy. But we don't do it alone. Together, we fight to protect what makes small business thrive. We have the service and expertise to compete with big business, so we stand for a tax code that treats us fairly. We rally to reform regulations, because we know what enterprising minds could do when released from their $2 trillion burden. We lead the charge to find a real health insurance solution that won't destroy our bottom lines. We balance our budgets, and we challenge Washington to live up to that same standard. We shape small business policy by connecting directly with legislators. Some of us are legislators. Our time is now. Our outlook has never been better. We are the National Federation of Independent Business. We are small business, and we are bigger together.
What is glamour? Frailty. What is desire? Diamonds. They say a life lived without passion is hardly worth living.
Ma'am? Ma'am? Ma'am?
Dang, this one made me feel all special.
Locally loved restaurants like Farina Pizzeria, Farina Alto, and the Artichoke Cafe are the perfect venue for your next event. Farina Alto has traditional Italian food, plus handcrafted cocktails in a beautiful Northeast Heights location. Farina Pizzeria with a downtown vibe, amazing affordable wines, and local beer. And the Artichoke Cafe has set the standard for casual fine dining since 1989. Visit our family of restaurants and see what fine dining is all about.
Well, I'm going to the frontier, walking to the cashier, order up a root beer and a #1. Cover it with green stuff, one scoop is not enough. Find a booth is real tough, back by the Duke. Meet my family, meet my friends in the quirkiest restaurant I have ever been. All of Albuquerque's favorite spot, it's the Frontier Restaurant.
The Frontier Restaurant is a proud supporter of ProView Sports Network.
The New Mexico High School Coaches Association, established in 1941, is an organization of New Mexico's best and most professional interscholastic coaches. Coaches across work daily to help our student athletes excel in the classroom, on the field of play, and in our communities. Students that participate in interscholastic activities attain higher grades, higher graduation rates, and higher wages. Responsible for the North-South All-Star Games, statewide Coaches Award Program, and providing multiple professional development opportunities for New Mexico's coaches. Be a great coach by coaching beyond the game.
Welcome back to the ABQ Show. We're visiting with Jason Espinoza, the State Director of the National Federation of Independent Business, NFIB. So Jason, we just had a legislative session in Santa Fe. They were up there helping us for 60 days, and although that always doesn't seem like that translates into something that small businesses like, Give me your overall impressions of the session, and then we can talk about some of the specific bills that passed.
Well, I think this session, what we saw overall was some extreme bills introduced at the legislature. You know, just for example, you saw $15 minimum wage bills. You saw some other bills that were really extreme. At the end of the day, the bills that passed and were signed into law, while not extreme, were still harmful to small businesses. So, you know, minimum wage was the big deal during the legislative session. I talked about the $15 minimum wage being introduced. At the end of the day, what we saw was a compromise. What many people saw, what will end up with $12 an hour up in 2023. And while this is a win, it's not $15, it still is going to have a significant impact on small businesses across New Mexico.
And on that particular one, something that, you know, it made perfect sense what I heard it is that bill that just passed will probably disproportionately impact rural New Mexico because Santa Fe, Albuquerque, Las Cruces already have minimum wage bills. And those businesses in the urban areas have had to deal with this.
Right.
The rural parts of New Mexico, many of which are really, really struggling, are going to have to figure out either how to pay higher wages or make their business model work otherwise.
Right. When you look at it, you're saying, oh, it's only a $5 increase. Yeah, well, it's almost a 90% increase over what they're paying right now in minimum wage when you're looking at it. So, and when you're looking at the cost, I mean, if you have 10 employees, that's, you know, 90% pay increase for each employee. Right. And then on top of that, one thing that a lot of people weren't discussing is the impact to a small business employer's unemployment insurance. That's tied to your wages that you pay your employees. So you're going to see
your FICA is 7.5% of a higher amount.
Everything's going to increase by 90%. So it's not just the wage, it's a significant cost to small business.
Well, the other thing that comes up that, again, I did not hear very much about this in the debate in Santa Fe is, you know, if the rate goes from $7 to $12 an hour and you already have somebody who's making $12 an hour, all the people below them are now making the same. It tends to put pressure on raising rates throughout anyone making probably less than $20 or $25 an hour.
No, you're exactly right about that. When you look at it, I mean, everyone's rates is going to have to proportionally increase. That person that was making $12 an hour, or $12.50 and was feeling pretty good, $5.50 above the minimum wage. Well, now they're only making 50 cents. They're going to be in their boss's office asking for a wage increase as well. So it's going to have significant impacts across the board.
All right. Now, what's another one that is going to be impactful to small business in New Mexico?
Well, you know, there were certainly proposals. These didn't pass. You know, cross my fingers and say thank goodness for those. We'll see them in future things. When you're looking at paid sick leave, paid family and medical leave, a lot of those, again, would have had significant impacts on the employer, not only from a financial cost perspective, but also from a compliance perspective. We talked about this a little earlier. You know, when I read bills looking at it from NFIB's perspective, when I'm reading a 50-page bill that describes how you're supposed to implement family paid family leave, if I can't understand the bill and it's my job to, how is a business owner going to understand that bill? They're going to be put at a significant disadvantage and maybe, you know, sued because of the way they implement it. It's really dangerous and scary.
Well, and to just put in that perspective, this is not your first rodeo this last session. You have been analyzing business policy, business legislation for a long time. And so that really means something. If you're having a hard time understanding it, that means that, you know, what's a small business going to do?
No, exactly. And to that point, when you get these complicated regulations that may be ambiguous, really confusing, and we are seeing an avalanche of them, you know, again, this impacts the small business community. And many times what happens is you see them shut down because they can't afford to, because they get in legal trouble. They can't afford their rent anymore. And really what that means is that if New Mexico continues on this trend, what we're going to see, small business shut down, and really out-of-state corporations come in and taking their place. And that's really going to be sad for when we look at, again, those favorability numbers.
People love their small businesses.
They do. You know, there was a Pew Research Center study that ranked small business as the best perceived American institution.
Right.
Yet, for some reason, we're looking at putting into place that policies that's going to replace our Main Street businesses with bigger corporations. It doesn't make sense.
Well, and, you know, just an example, it also speaks to employment in general as opposed to contractors here in New Mexico is, you know, the business owners I know, they do a pretty darn good job of taking care of their employees without these forced policies, meaning they're very flexible when people have issues. But if you have something like a family leave and you have one employee and that person goes on family leave and it has to be fully compensated.
Right.
You have one employee that you hired that can't do their job. You're paying, most or all of their salary, and now you have to do something else, hire another employee. It really does hurt at that business that's thinking of adding an employee, thinking of adding a second and third. And it doesn't just hurt small business. I do think it tends to hurt employees, particularly those that aren't already working for the big companies.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, when you look at the vast majority of small businesses between 1 and 10 employees, most of those are either your family members that are your employees, or you know what, even if they're not really family members, they're like your family because you're so small, you know them on a personal level. It's a small business environment. And many times, even though it may not be on the books in your employee handbook, that employer is going to, if they get sick or if there's an issue, that owner is going to say, you know what, go take care of your family, go do what you need to do, we'll figure it out. But when we see these one-size-fits-all solutions, it many times disadvantages the employer, but it disadvantages the employee as well, because you see a loss of flexibility.
Well, I've seen that firsthand with myself, with other family members of mine, with lots of people in the community, they've been treated very, very fairly, but they've been done so by an employer who doesn't have this huge overhead cost. So they've gotten as much time and maybe more in some cases than would have been required in some of these family leave proposals, but they didn't have the huge tens of thousands of dollars of overhead to put in these policies and administer.
No, you're exactly right. And we saw a couple years ago here in Albuquerque a ballot initiative to implement a one-size-fits-all paid sick leave proposal. And when I was going around and talking to employers about that, one of the things that they were saying is, look, there's going to be a cost to that.
Right.
But as a small business owner, what I do is I try to meet with my employees and I see what's important to them.
Right.
If they really want Christmas bonuses and that's important, and I'm giving them $5,000 each employee, $5,000, but if I'm forced to do a paid sick leave thing, well, I'm going to have to take that $5,000 benefit that they're getting to implement this paid leave system that they may or may not want. But small business owners know their employees. They work with them. They're like family. So how do we build systems that incentivize them and allow them to have this flexibility?
No, that's a great point. And as I recall, the heavy-handed nature of that bill that was, our ordinance that was defeated in Albuquerque, it would even apply to temporary and part-time. Those are the last people that want their salary in a benefit that they don't need. You know what I mean?
Right.
I'm working part-time for a month or two in the summer. Why would I want sick leave?
Right.
So,
I mean, at the end of the day, what folks need to realize is every business is different. Every small business is different. Every industry is different. And allowing them to develop their own systems that work for their employees.
Okay, so if I were to put you in charge of policy for New Mexico, what do you, and again, I always have ideas, so you don't have to agree with me, but what do you think one of the existing policies of New Mexico that is hurting small businesses disproportionately that we really need to look at as a state?
It's really hard to pick out one, and I've used this word several times, is there's an avalanche of regulations. Right. And so really one of my frustrations up in Santa Fe is when they're proposing a new regulation, and then you stand up, and I'll stand up and oppose it with other business advocates, and they say, oh, but this one by itself is not that bad.
Right.
Well, it may not be that bad, but along with the hundreds of other regulations that small businesses are having to comply with at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level, those are great cause for concern. Yeah. So, there's always been talk about, and even the president's talked about that, if you're going to implement a new regulation, let's take two off the table at the same time. And there really needs to be wholesale reform on regulations that impact businesses.
Yeah. Now, as we look out over the kind of totality of taxes, regulations in New Mexico, we don't have anything that's totally out of whack, with one exception on the taxation, in my opinion, and that's our gross receipts tax. And the taxation of services tends to really hurt small businesses, because, correct me if I'm wrong, I do this, I go out and I hire an independent contractor. If they're in New Mexico, I have to pay gross receipts tax on that. In very few cases can I deduct that gross receipts tax when I take whatever project we're working on. So you end up paying that gross receipts tax a couple of times, and when it starts off at 8%, you don't need to multiply it by more than 1 or 2 to have that be huge. What are your thoughts on gross receipts tax? Because I heard nothing in Santa Fe. There was no appetite for that this year to even talk about it.
No, I think you're exactly right. I mean, especially, with the gross receipts tax here in New Mexico, putting a tax on, business-to-business professional services it's something that really no other state in our country does.
Right.
And so it is an added burden, especially to small business. Again, you know, there's been efforts in the last couple years, not this year,
Right.
to really look at wholesale tax reform, which includes looking at the gross receipts tax and how do you reduce that, because like you were saying, sometimes that tax is applied over and over.
Right.
And so tax pyramiding is a huge
Yeah,
issue.
pyramiding, layering, it's called different. Pyramiding is probably the one that I hear the most. So.
It is, and so, you know, we really do need to look at ways to reduce that burden. And I go back, look, it's been proven, the studies have shown, you know, relative to the big federal tax cuts with small businesses, when small businesses are able to save dollars on reduced taxes,
Right.
they invest it in their employees, they invest it in the community. So we really do need a way to look at that and move that forward here in the state.
All right. Any other highlights you want to go over that happened in the session, either that they're considering that you took care of or that went in that people might not be aware of?
I think one of the things we talked about personal income taxes and
Right.
how that affects small business owners. So there was a big tax package, I'll say a tax increase package
Right.
that was passed this year. The original version that passed the House would have instituted $350 million of new taxes this year. It was pared down.
In
to-
a year where they had
and
over $1 billion of
You're
additional
exactly right.
money, right?
You're right, and it had huge personal income tax, issues in it. And the one that finally passed the legislature was pared down. It's about $90 million worth.
Right.
There is a provision that's, interestingly, they made it contingent on revenues.
Okay.
So there's potentially a new top personal income tax bracket when you're looking at joint filers with over $315,000 in revenue or in income. They'll have a new bracket of 5.9%. The high's right now at 4.9%. Again, that's only contingent on if FY20 revenues don't match what FY19 revenues on.
Right.
So that's a potential impact, but it's really interesting to see how the legislature's grappling with it. But we are really glad that that initial tax package did not end up at the governor's desk.
Because it was so large.
It was
would have
large. It was significant.
You know, and one thing that we saw in the downturn of the 2008 period was New Mexico doesn't get very much of its revenue from income taxes. So raising those a lot or lowering them a lot,
Right.
it may be very, very important to business growth
Right.
and people's investment in the state, but that tends to be one of the smallest things that actually impacts, you know, and it's like, it's too negative by half, but people say, well, we don't have much income in New Mexico, so there's not much income tax is going to do. Those other taxes, however, gross receipts are huge for us.
No, they certainly are, and you know, and I think one of the things that we always need to remember about small business owners, there are risk takers, there are trailblazers in our community. If we don't create an environment that incentivizes them to continue putting their money at risk and investing at risk, then we're not going to see the continued job creation that we are.
Right. Well, and you know, there are stories out there, and you know, I don't think anecdotes make the trend, but you know, New Mexico has been shown to not be real good for millennials, not be real good for startup entrepreneurs, some who change, and I do think, you know, I know that's not the focus of NFIB, but those grassroots issues that make small business easier can tend to help a wide range of businesses in our state.
No, you're exactly right, and especially when you're looking at you know, the export of our young people to other states and how they're leaving, and our population is really flatlined. That impacts small businesses' ability to hire employees. When we're talking about seeing growth, now the big thing is who are we going to pay? Who are the qualified workforce? And so that has a huge impact on our businesses.
Well, Jason, it was a great conversation. Really appreciate all the great information you shared. Jason Espinoza with the National Federation of Independent Business here on the ABQ Show on ProView Networks. Thank you very much for watching.